Close your eyes. Let the city fade in around you. It's winter 1930. New York breathes in smoke and snow, a city divided by loyalty and ambition. Two names hang in the cold air like unfinished prayers. Joe, the boss, Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, old world titans locked in a quiet war for the soul of the underworld. But beneath their noise, another generation is watching. Men with sharper suits, steadier voices and colder dreams. Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello. They see what the old men cannot, that the future will not belong to kings, but to architects. Tonight's story drifts through the streets where those architects first learned to whisper instead of shout. Through the cafes where loyalty was bought with silence, and power passed hands over wine instead of bullets. Through the quiet birth of an empire that would outlive every man who built it. So take a breath. Let the rain fall against the window. And listen, as the old world burns. And a new one, calm and calculating, begins to rise. This is the story of the Castellammarese War, and the night America's underworld learned to sleep in order. The winter of 1930 came to New York like an old debt collector. Slow, quiet, and unrelenting. Snow drifted through the narrow canyons of Mulberry Street, catching the glow of street lamps that had seen too many secrets. The cobblestones were slick with melted frost and the faint trace of spilled wine from the night before. Behind fogged windows, families ate simple meals and murmured in Sicilian, Neapolitan, Calabrese, the old tongues of the island men who now ruled these streets from behind butcher shops and cigar counters. At the corner of Hester and Mott, a restaurant kept its lights low long after closing. Inside, the smoke from cheap cigars hung like a ghost above the tables. A man sat alone at the far end, his thick hands resting on a linen napkin that had turned gray from ash. They called him Joe the Boss, Giuseppe Masseria, and in this city, his name carried the weight of judgment. He wasn't a tall man, but his presence filled the room. The kind of presence that made laughter stop mid-sentence. The kind that turned confidence into silence. He had a habit of cracking his knuckles before speaking, as though reminding everyone he didn't need to shout to be understood. A violin played faintly from the radio behind the bar, its melody swallowed by the hum of refrigeration and the click of the ceiling fan. Masseria lifted his wine glass and studied the surface, watching the ripples settle. Outside, the city moved under a blanket of cold and fear. Rival crews shifted allegiances like wind on the Hudson. Every whisper carried a question. Every handshake had a hidden meaning. He had ruled this world for years, collecting dues from bootleggers, gamblers, and loan sharks who paid not just for permission, but for protection from him. He believed the old ways were the only ways, the Sicilian code of honor, the unquestioned loyalty to a single boss, the belief that power should flow through blood and fear. But something in the city had changed. There was a restlessness in the air, a quiet rebellion moving beneath the surface. Men who spoke English as easily as Italian. Men who dressed in tailored suits and carried American ambition in their pockets. Men like Charles Lucky Luciano. Lucky was still young then, 20-something, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that disarmed before it deceived. He had worked for Masseria for years, learning how power moved through silence. But he had also seen a future his boss could not imagine. A future where money mattered more than bloodlines, where wars were bad for business, and where the streets of New York could be run like a company, not a kingdom. On nights like this, he would walk through Little Italy in his overcoat, collar turned up, his polished shoes crunching the thin crust of snow. The streets smelled of chestnuts and coal smoke, a mix of poverty and promise. He would nod at the old men who watched from stoops, eyes sunken, hands folded like prayer. In his mind he was already somewhere else, not Sicily, not America, but something in between. A new world born in the shadows of the old. At the next corner, a black Ford idled by the curb, its headlights off. Inside, two men whispered in Sicilian. "He's getting soft," one said. "The kid thinks he can talk to everyone. Jews, Irish, even those Cuban boys. The boss won't like it." The other man nodded, his fingers tracing the outline of a pistol hidden beneath his coat. "Then the boss will teach him a lesson." But Lucky knew the lesson already. He had learned it the hard way when he was kidnapped by rival gangsters a few months earlier, beaten, stabbed, left for dead on Staten Island. They called it a warning. But it became something else. When he survived, with half his face scarred and one eye that never blinked the same again, he understood the truth that would define his life. Fear and respect are two sides of the same coin. Now, as he stood outside Masseria's restaurant that winter night, watching smoke curl from the kitchen vent, he felt neither fear nor respect, only patience. Inside, the boss was entertaining his lieutenants, pouring them wine, telling stories about the old days in Sicily when men settled scores with knives, not lawyers. His laughter was rough and full, but underneath it was a kind of weariness. The kind that comes when a man knows his empire is built on borrowed time. A young waiter slipped out the back door carrying a bucket of scraps. He dumped it into the alley and looked up to see Lucky watching him. Their eyes met for a moment. The waiter froze, sensing the weight of that calm gaze. Luciano smiled faintly, then nodded, turning away into the falling snow. Somewhere across town, another meeting was taking place, in a modest apartment above a bakery in Brooklyn. The smell of fresh bread mixed with gun oil. Salvatore Maranzano sat at a wooden table, his coat still dusted with snow. He was older than Masseria, with sharp eyes and the manner of a Roman general. On the wall behind him hung a map of New York divided by colored pins, each marking a territory, a family, a street corner worth dying for. Around the table sat men who had come from the same tiny Sicilian town of Castellammarese del Golfo. They listened as Maranzano spoke softly about order, discipline, and tradition. Masseria is not a boss, he said. He is a merchant. A collector. He has forgotten the meaning of honor. The men nodded, their expressions solemn. For them this wasn't just business. It was a crusade. A way to restore the dignity of the old country in this new world of jazz and prohibition and cash registers. They believed in Maranzano the way soldiers believe in a flag. And so, quietly, a war began. Not the kind fought with armies, but with whispers, ambushes, and funerals held in the rain. Newspapers called it gang violence, but to those who lived it, it was a civil war of shadows, the Castellammarese War. Weeks passed and bodies began to turn up in alleys, slumped over steering wheels or floating by the docks. No one saw who fired the shots. No one dared to ask. The police, tired of chasing ghosts, wrote their reports and closed the cases. In the bars of Little Italy, men drank in silence, eyes on the door, wondering whose turn was next. Lucky Luciano watched it all unfold with a kind of detached sadness. He met with Meyer Lansky in a dim apartment overlooking Delancey Street. The two men shared a bottle of gin and a vision that seemed impossible amid the chaos. "This can't last," Meyer said, his voice steady. "They'll kill each other until there's nothing left to run." Lucky leaned back in his chair, smoke curling from his cigarette. "Maybe that's what needs to happen. Let the old guard finish themselves off. Then we build something better." "Better?" Meyer smiled faintly. "You mean bigger." Lucky didn't deny it. "Business needs structure. No more boss of bosses. No more wars. Just men who understand money, not blood." Outside, a horn sounded somewhere in the fog. A steamboat load on the East River. The world was changing and they could feel it in their bones. In the weeks that followed, Masseria tightened his grip. He demanded loyalty oaths, collected larger tributes, executed suspected traitors without trial. His paranoia became a poison that spread through his crew. Men began to disappear. Some switched sides, others vanished entirely. One evening, as snow fell thick against the windows, Lucky was summoned to meet the boss. He found Masseria sitting at the same table, the same half-empty bottle of Chianti beside him. "You're getting too friendly with outsiders," Masseria said without looking up. "That Jew Lansky. The Irish. The uptown boys. You forget where you come from." Lucky kept his tone calm. "I remember, boss. I just think we can make more money if we stop killing each other." Masseria laughed, a rough, bitter sound. "You sound like an American. You think dollars make you a man? No. Respect does. Fear does." Lucky looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe so." When he left the restaurant that night, the streets were quiet, the snow deep enough to muffle every sound. His breath hung in the air like smoke. He didn't know yet how it would end, only that it must. One way or another, the old world would have to die for the new one to live. And as he walked toward the waiting car, the sound of church bells drifted from somewhere down the block, soft, distant, and sorrowful. A city praying for peace it would never have. Above the rooftops, the first light of morning began to creep through the clouds. Somewhere a gun was being loaded. Somewhere a deal was being made. And in the stillness before the next storm, Lucky Luciano smiled faintly to himself. He could already see the future taking shape. A future where the Mafia would no longer belong to the old men of Sicily, but to the quiet architects of America. Winter gave way to a fragile spring, but New York stayed gray. The rain came often, fine and relentless, washing away the grime but never the blood. In the narrow streets of Little Italy, steam rose from manhole covers and from the kitchens of bakeries that never closed. Life continued, but beneath it ran the low hum of tension, like a string drawn too tight. People no longer lingered outside the cafes. They spoke in whispers, glancing over their shoulders, counting faces at the tables, counting who was gone. Joe Masseria's men still patrolled the neighborhood, coats buttoned to the neck, hats pulled low. They collected envelopes, offered protection, spread fear in the name of respect. Their loyalty was something learned, not felt, an obedience shaped by old country rules. They called it omerta, the code of silence. You didn't speak, didn't question, didn't forget. Masseria had come to America decades earlier with nothing but his fists and his will. He had seen men rise and fall, had turned bootlegging into a fortune, had outlived rivals who once thought themselves untouchable. Yet now he felt something slipping. The young no longer bowed the way they used to. They carried themselves differently, straight-backed, well-dressed, American. They laughed too easily. They did not fear the weight of his name the way his generation once did. In his home on East 12th Street, Masseria ate dinner alone, the clatter of silverware echoing against the walls. His wife had long since stopped asking where he went at night. His bodyguard stood outside, shivering in the cold, pretending not to hear the arguments through the door. He still believed himself to be the ruler of New York, but his empire was shrinking with every week. The old world had rules, rituals, codes, and a certain poetry in its cruelty. The new world had speed, ambition, and no patience for ghosts. Across the river, in Brooklyn, Salvatore Maranzano sat in a rented apartment that doubled as his war room. The furniture was sparse, the floorboards creaked, but on his desk lay an array of maps and names written in careful script. He moved pieces across the paper like a chess master. To him, this war was not chaos but a campaign. He believed in hierarchy, in obedience, in the sacred chain of command that stretched from ancient Rome to the streets of America. He told his men stories of Caesar and Brutus, of discipline and betrayal. A family, he said, must be built on respect, not greed. He looked around the room at the faces of men who had crossed oceans to serve him. Masseria is finished. He rules by fear, not by faith. We will bring order to this city again. One of his lieutenants, a young Sicilian with restless eyes, asked quietly, "And what of the Americans? The young ones who think they can change everything?" Maranzano smiled thinly. "They will learn. Or they will disappear." But in Manhattan, Lucky Luciano was already rewriting the rules. He had stopped wearing his fedora low like the old men did. He had begun frequenting nightclubs uptown, mingling with the Jewish and Irish racketeers Masseria despised. He met bankers, crooked cops, union bosses. He listened more than he spoke, learning how money could move through a city like blood through veins, unseen, unstoppable. Sometimes he visited his mother on 10th Street. She would scold him in Sicilian for staying out late, for dressing too well, for smelling of whiskey instead of church incense. He would kiss her cheek and promise to be careful. But in his mind he was already far from her world. He believed the old world code was a cage, a beautiful one carved with loyalty and pride but still a cage. He respected it but he would not die for it. One rainy evening he met Meyer Lansky at a hotel suite overlooking the East River. The curtains were drawn, the lights low. The two men spoke softly over a bottle of scotch. "They think loyalty is about blood," Meyer said. "But blood doesn't buy whiskey and it doesn't stop bullets." Lucky leaned back, the smoke from his cigarette curling like ribbon. "It's not about loyalty anymore. It's about logic. They kill each other for pride, but pride doesn't pay the bills." Meyer smiled faintly. "Then what does?" "Order," Lucky said. "Real order. Like a business. Everyone gets a piece, no one plays emperor." Meyer raised his glass. "To the future, then." Lucky nodded. "To the future." The war dragged on. The newspapers wrote about it like a storm that would never end. Bodies were found in alleys, cars, even in bathtubs filled with ice. No one spoke to the police. No one dared. The people learned to live with fear as if it were weather. Some days heavier, some days light. Through it all, Lucky kept his head low, his hands clean, his ears open. He paid tribute to Masseria when he had to, but his heart was already gone. He was waiting for the right moment, the right deal, the right shift in the wind. One night, he found himself in a speakeasy on the Lower East Side. Jazz floated through the room, warm and melancholy. The women wore sequins and feathers, the men laughed too loudly. Lucky sat in a corner booth, his tie loosened, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. Across from him sat Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, all restless energy and sharp eyes. "You really think this Maranzano's different?" Bugsy asked. "No," Lucky said softly. "He's the same kind of old man, just with better Latin." Bugsy smirked. "Then why not pick a side?" Lucky exhaled slowly, watching the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Because I'm building a new one. The next morning, the city woke to another murder. A Masseria lieutenant found shot in his car, hands still on the steering wheel. The police took photographs, reporters scribbled notes, and the cycle continued. But to those who understood the game, the pattern was clear. The old families were bleeding each other dry, and in the spaces between their feuds, a new kind of power was growing, silent, deliberate, inevitable. By late spring, Lucky's meetings became more frequent, quieter, more deliberate. He began talking to both sides, pretending loyalty to both, promising peace to each. It was a delicate dance, and he moved through it like a shadow. To Masseria he was the obedient son. To Maranzano the thoughtful emissary. To himself he was neither. He was something new. He often thought of the code, the old world's sacred silence. Omerta had kept men alive for centuries, but it had also kept them blind. In Sicily silence was survival. In America silence was suffocation. He would honor the past by surpassing it. One evening, as twilight settled over the Hudson, Lucky stood on the balcony of a friend's apartment. The city stretched beneath him like a living machine, lights flickering, engines humming, rivers of people moving through streets that never truly slept. He thought of the men who had come before him, the ones who built this empire out of dirt and blood. He felt no contempt for them, only inevitability. A soft knock sounded behind him. It was one of his associates, a quiet kid named Vito. "They're ready for you downstairs," he said. Lucky turned, slipping on his coat. "Good. Let's go talk about peace." In the car, the driver kept his eyes on the road, the city lights sliding over his face. "You really think they'll ever stop fighting?" he asked. Lucky smiled faintly. "Not until someone makes them believe they can't afford not to." The rain began to fall again, gentle and rhythmic against the windshield. The streets shimmered under it, slick and dark. Somewhere in Little Italy, Masseria was sitting in his favorite chair, muttering about loyalty. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Maranzano was whispering about honor. And in between them, Lucky Luciano was planning the quietest revolution New York had ever seen. It would not come with a roar but with a sigh. Not through blood but through balance. Not by destroying the old code but by rewriting it, line by line, in smoke and silence. And as the night deepened and the city exhaled, the sound of jazz faded into the distance, and only the rhythm of the rain remained. The war would go on for now. But beneath it, something new was stirring. A shape taking form in the quiet. The shape of what was coming next. Spring slid into summer without ever warming the city. The air in Little Italy smelled of rain and smoke, of tomatoes crushed in the gutter, of fear. Vendors still called out the price of fish, still stacked crates of oranges beneath the awnings, but their voices had changed. Lower now, cautious, as if every syllable might invite a bullet. The street was alive with color yet drained of joy. Beneath the rhythm of footsteps and trolley wheels, another rhythm pulsed. The heartbeat of a war no one wanted to name aloud. Masseria's men moved like shadows through the markets. They collected payments from shopkeepers who no longer looked them in the eye. They whispered promises of protection, but everyone knew what that meant. Across the street, Maranzano scouts appeared the same way, clean coats, polite smiles, pistols heavy beneath their jackets. The old women who once sat gossiping on stoops now stayed inside, curtains drawn. Even the church bells seemed quieter, their chimes swallowed by the tension that hung between brick walls. Lucky Luciano watched it all unfold from a distance. He had begun to notice how easily chaos became routine, how men adjusted to danger as they did to the weather. Fascinated him. Fear could become background noise like the hum of the city itself. And while the others fought to control blocks and corners, he studied people, their habits, their hungers, the things they would trade for safety or pride. He was learning that power was not about bullets or titles, it was about belief. People believed you could protect them, you didn't need to shoot them. If they believed you were inevitable, they would come to you willingly. At dawn, the pushcart men rolled through the alleys to claim their spots at the curb. They spoke in low tones, eyes flicking to every passing car. Someone had been found behind the fish market the night before, a driver for one of Masseria's captains. The newspapers called it another gang slaying. The locals called it bad luck. Luciano read the article over coffee, tracing the lines of print with his finger. The picture showed nothing, only a blur of reporters in raincoats. He folded the paper carefully, set it aside, and said nothing. By noon, the markets were crowded again, the illusion of normalcy restored. Housewives bargained for eggplants, children chased one another through puddles, a street violinist played an old Sicilian song that no one truly heard. The smell of bread and gasoline mingled in the air. And then, without warning, the sound came, a short burst like firecrackers muffled by distance. People froze. The violin stopped. Two men in gray coats stumbled from a butcher's doorway, one clutching his stomach, the other firing blindly into the street. Screams broke the stillness. Crates of fruit overturned, oranges rolling like marbles across the cobblestones. The gunmen vanished as suddenly as they appeared. When the echoes faded, a silence deeper than shock filled the market. Somewhere, a baby began to cry. By evening, rumors had already twisted the story beyond recognition. Some said it was Maranzano's revenge. Others swore it was an inside job, punishment for betrayal. In the speakeasies, men debated in whispers while jazz records played softly to mask their words. The city learned to keep talking while saying nothing. That night, Luciano met Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel in a quiet room above a garage in the Bronx. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as trains rumbled in the distance. On the table lay maps, ledgers, and a half-empty bottle of rye. "It's getting worse," Meyer said, flipping open a newspaper. 5 dead this week. 2 from Masseria's side, 3 from Maranzano's. Nobody remembers why anymore. Bugsy paced near the window. "They're tearing the city apart over pride. There's money lying in the streets and all they want to do is shoot each other." Luciano didn't answer right away. He poured himself a drink, watching the amber swirl in the glass. "They can't stop," he said finally. "The old men don't know another way. They think if they talk peace they look weak. So they bleed instead." Meyer studied him. "And you?" "I wait," Luciano said softly, "until they bleed enough to listen." Outside, thunder rolled across the river. Rain followed, steady and cold, drumming on the tin roof like fingers counting time. The 3 men sat in silence, the air thick with tobacco and the quiet knowledge that patience could be deadlier than any gun. Days turned to weeks. The war spread beyond Little Italy, into Brooklyn, the Bronx, even Jersey. Bootlegging routes were hijacked, warehouses torched, drivers disappeared. The city police pretended control, raiding the wrong places, posing for photographs beside barrels of confiscated gin. But everyone knew who really ran New York. Men whose names never appeared in print, men who shook hands in back rooms and left no fingerprints behind. In early July, Masseria summoned his captains to a meeting at his restaurant. The blinds were drawn, the air thick with cigar smoke. He slammed his fist on the table, sending ash scattering. "Enough," he barked. "Maranzano wants a war, he'll get one. From now on, no deals, no truces. We strike first." His lieutenants nodded, some out of loyalty, some out of fear. Lucky sat among them, face calm, eyes unreadable. He listened as orders were given, names listed, payments promised. When it ended, he rose, straightened his tie, and walked out into the night without a word. The city smelled of wet brick and gasoline. Somewhere a saxophone wailed from an upstairs window. He thought of the men who would die because of what had just been said and felt nothing, only a slow, quiet certainty that this madness would end on his terms. A few nights later, he met secretly with a messenger from Maranzano. They spoke briefly, cautiously, in the back of a dark church where the candles burned low. The messenger's accent was thick, his voice steady. "Maranzano respects you," he said. "He believes you are a man of reason. Perhaps there is a place for you when the war is done." Luciano nodded, his breath forming ghosts in the cold air. "Tell him respect goes both ways." When the man left, Lucky lingered, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade through the nave. The smell of wax and incense hung heavy. He stared at the crucifix above the altar and wondered how many prayers it had heard from men like him. Men who killed for order, who lied for peace, who believed they could build something clean from corruption. He didn't pray. He simply whispered, "Soon," and walked out into the fog. By late summer, the markets had changed again. Many stalls stood empty. Fish rotted on melting ice, crates gathered flies. The people had learned to move quickly, to keep their heads down. Even the rats seemed quieter. In some alleys, the silence was so complete it felt sacred. On one such evening, Meyer Lansky stood beside Luciano on the fire escape of a tenement overlooking Canal Street. Below them, the city glowed faintly through mist. "They're calling it the Castellammarese War now," Meyer said. "Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Lucky smiled without humor. "War's end. This will end too." "How?" "With a meal," he said. "Just like everything else in this business." Meyer looked at him sharply. "You're serious?" Lucky's gaze stayed on the street below. "Masseria thinks loyalty is what keeps men together. But loyalty's just fear wearing a suit. You take away the fear, you take away the need for him." Meyer exhaled slowly. And then we start fresh. A table instead of a throne. Lightning flickered far to the south, brief and silent. The wind carried the smell of rain and the low rumble of the elevated train. The city, in all its noise and sleeplessness, seemed to pause for a heartbeat, as if holding its breath. That heartbeat stretched through the weeks that followed. Assassinations became common enough to lose their sting. Gunfire blended with thunder, funerals with Sunday mass. The lines between right and wrong blurred until no one remembered which side they were on. Men died for reasons forgotten before their bodies cooled. And through it all, Luciano's calm grew heavier, denser, like air before a storm. In September, as leaves began to curl and darken along the avenues, word spread that Maranzano had taken another of Masseria's rackets. Masseria responded with fury, ordering reprisals so savage that even his own soldiers hesitated. The city shuddered under the weight of invisible war. One night, Lucky sat alone in a cab, the driver silent as they crossed the Williamsburg Bridge. The skyline shimmered through rain, spires and smoke and the dull glow of 1,000 windows. He thought of the faces he had seen since it began, the friends lost, the money wasted, the endless funerals. He thought of the smell of gunpowder clinging to his suits, the taste of fear that lingered after every meeting. He realized he had stopped dreaming altogether. Sleep had become a luxury, trust a fantasy. When the car stopped outside a tenement, he paid the driver and stepped into the wet street. He paused beneath a flickering lamp, letting the rain soak into his hair, his coat. Somewhere nearby, a phonograph played faintly through an open window, a woman's voice soft and distant. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let himself imagine the world he wanted. One without the endless funerals, without the old men shouting about honor. A world run quietly, efficiently, like a business that never slept. Then he opened his eyes again and the moment was gone. By October, the markets had turned colder. The smell of chestnuts replaced that of blood, but only barely. People spoke of the coming winter the way soldiers speak of rest, uncertain if it would ever arrive. Masseria, cornered but defiant, began to see enemies in every shadow. His paranoia grew into a ritual. He changed meeting places nightly, tested his food, watched his own men for signs of betrayal. Luciano remained loyal outwardly. He smiled, he nodded, he carried messages. But inside he felt the line tightening around them all. The old world code that had once bound these men together was unraveling, thread by thread. One night, as frost began to cling to the rooftops, Lucky met Meyer again in a silent cafe near the docks. Only the hum of the refrigerator broke the stillness. "It can't go on," Meyer said. "No," Lucky answered. "And it won't." Meyer studied his face. "You've already decided, haven't you?" Luciano looked out the window at the river, black and endless. "The future doesn't wait for permission." He rose, put on his hat and walked out into the cold. The fog swallowed him whole. Behind him the city kept breathing, slow, uneasy, eternal. The war would claim a few more yet, but its ending had already been written, quietly in the calm of that night. And in the markets, where the blood had long since dried to rust beneath the stalls, life continued. Children laughed again. Vendors called their prices. The city pretended it had forgotten. But in the corners where shadows gather, everyone knew. The silence meant something new was coming. Something colder, cleaner, and far more dangerous than war. Autumn came quietly, drifting down over New York like a tired sigh. The heat of summer was gone, but the war lingered, thin as smoke, thick as rumor. The leaves along Mulberry Street turned the color of dried blood, and the gutters filled with paper and dust. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew the city was splitting in two. By October 1930, the Castellammarese war had become less a fight than a fever. No corner was safe. A man could sell oranges in the morning and be found face down in the East River by nightfall. The papers printed photographs of black cars abandoned beneath bridges, but the names were left blank. Editors understood the price of recognition. Inside cafes, men whispered in two languages. In one corner sat Masseria's soldiers, loud with forced laughter. In another, Maranzano's men drank quietly, eyes like glass. Between them moved waiters pretending not to listen. A spilled glass could start a firefight. A handshake could end a life. Joe Masseria had grown heavier that year. His suits no longer fit, his temper shortened. He ruled from habit, not confidence. Each sunrise brought news of another ambush, another friend lost, another betrayal suspected. His empire was now a room filled with smoke and worry. Across the river, Salvatore Maranzano felt the same weight. Victory, so close in his dreams, seemed to recede the harder he reached for it. His lieutenants spoke of exhaustion, of endless funerals, of wives afraid to leave their homes. Yet he refused to yield. He saw himself as Caesar, if Caesar had traded a laurel crown for a fedora. Between them moved Lucky Luciano, silent, deliberate, wearing neutrality like a well-tailored coat. To both sides he was the courteous mediator, the man who could speak to anyone. To himself he was already somewhere beyond the war, watching it from the calm future he intended to build. He met Meyer Lansky often in unremarkable apartments where the only light came from a single bulb. They spoke quietly while the city outside rattled with gunfire and sirens. "This can't hold," Meyer said. "They're bleeding each other dry." Lucky nodded. "Let them. When they've had enough, we'll give them something better to believe in." Meyer looked at him. "And if they never stop? Then we end it for them." In late October the cold settled early. Markets closed before dusk, cafes bolted doors. The few who ventured out walked fast, avoiding corners. Fear had become a kind of etiquette. Even the priests lowered their voices when giving blessings. Masseria began dining in private rooms, changing tables mid-meal, never trusting the same waiter twice. He no longer spoke of expansion, only survival. Some nights he stared out the window and muttered about ghosts. Other nights he talked about Sicily, about the hills and the olive groves he hadn't seen in 30 years. Luciano listened patiently, smiling where he should, answering softly. He knew the boss was unraveling. Power, once absolute, was now a mirror reflecting nothing back. Still he played the loyal soldier. To move too soon was to die too soon. Meanwhile, Maranzano reorganized his followers with almost religious precision. He issued uniforms of behavior, who stood, who sat, who spoke first. He demanded that his men call him Don Salvatore. The younger ones rolled their eyes behind his back. They admired his vision but not his vanity. A man could preach discipline only so long before others noticed the hunger beneath it. Luciano began visiting both camps under the pretense of truce. He carried messages no one read, promises no one kept. To Masseria he said, "They want peace." To Maranzano, "The boss grows tired." Each believed him because they wanted to. He was the bridge across a river that neither side would cross. Yet the cost of walking that bridge grew daily. Some of his friends were shot simply for knowing him. Others disappeared without warning. He slept little, ate less. The scar on his cheek burned when the weather changed. But the idea of order, of a commission that could govern without war, kept him steady. One gray afternoon he walked the docks alone, coat buttoned high, fedora pulled low. Seagulls circled above the empty piers. The city felt hollow, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. He thought of what Capone had once told him in Chicago: "There's more profit in peace than in victory." Peace, Lucky thought, would have to be manufactured the way whiskey was during Prohibition. Illicit, bottled and secret, sold to those desperate enough to pay. The first snow fell that November. Small flurries, hesitant, melting as they touched the pavement. People took it as a sign the violence might cool too, but the streets only grew quieter, heavier. Masseria's men patrolled with dull eyes. Maranzano's soldiers vanished into basements and whispered about the end. In a dim tenement room overlooking Canal Street, Lucky met with Bugsy Siegel. The younger man paced, restless. "When's it end, Charlie? You've got the brains, you've got both sides talking. What are we waiting for?" "For everyone to be too tired to notice," Lucky said. "Then we change everything." Bugsy smirked. "That simple?" Lucky looked out the window at the falling snow. "Nothing's simple. But it's possible." Later that night he returned to his apartment and stood before the mirror. The scar along his jaw caught the lamplight. He studied it the way a sculptor studies marble, proof of pain, proof of survival. Behind him, the city lights shimmered through frost. He could almost hear the hum of the future, distant but certain. Across town, Masseria sat before a plate of untouched pasta, his lieutenants whispering around him. He no longer trusted any of them. He believed betrayal could come from the air itself. Yet in that paranoia he saw only one loyal face, Luciano's. It comforted him. It doomed him. And in another apartment, Maranzano rehearsed his victory speech, dictating in slow Sicilian. "When the dust clears," he told his scribe, "we will build families each with its own territory. We will bring civilization to chaos." His voice trembled slightly when he said "we," as though he already felt how fragile it was. By Christmas the snow no longer melted. It lay thick on the rooftops, muting the city's heartbeat. The war had not ended, but it had grown strangely quiet, as if both sides were pausing to hear who would speak next. Luciano walked through Little Italy that night, hands deep in his coat pockets, breath misting in the cold. He passed shuttered stores, dark windows, the ghosts of laughter from summers before. He could sense the shift approaching, the last act before the curtain dropped. Soon he thought, one more meal, one more conversation. And this war, this madness would fade into memory. The street lamps flickered in the wind, casting long, wavering shadows across the snow. Somewhere far off, a church bell struck midnight. A city divided waited for morning, and for the quiet revolution that would bring it peace. January 1931 began without celebration. New York seemed to wake, look around, and decide there was nothing left worth cheering for. Snow fell without sound, covering the city's scars in white that would soon turn gray. The war had slowed but not stopped. It was now a whisper instead of a scream. The killings were fewer, quieter, more deliberate. A knife slipped between ribs in the dark, a car that never reached its destination. The newspapers called it a ceasefire. The streets called it exhaustion. Lucky Luciano moved through that quiet like smoke. He no longer carried guards, protection drew attention. Instead, he traveled with only his calm, a weapon sharper than any blade. To Masseria he was still a trusted lieutenant, to Maranzano a promising convert. To both he was indispensable. That illusion was his armor. Most nights he met Meyer Lansky in the back of a closed bakery near Delancey Street. The ovens were cold now, the air heavy with the smell of yeast and dust. They spoke softly, their breath visible in the chill. "It's all falling apart," Meyer said. "They're too proud to stop, too afraid to admit it." Lucky nodded. "Then we stop it for them." "How?" "With silence." He meant it. The future he imagined was one where power moved quietly. No headlines, no gunfire, no blood on cobblestones. Order would replace chaos, business would replace vendetta. But for that to happen, the old world had to bury itself. Across the river, Joe Masseria sat in his restaurant long after the last customer had gone. The blinds were drawn, the wine untouched. He no longer laughed. His lieutenants whispered that he slept in his office now, pistol under the pillow, convinced that ghosts of betrayal followed him from room to room. He trusted no one except Lucky Luciano, and perhaps that trust was the last thing keeping him alive. Meanwhile, Salvatore Maranzano waited in Brooklyn like a patient spider. He had reorganized his men into families, a word he borrowed from scripture and strategy alike. Each crew had its territory, its rules, its price. But behind his Roman discipline lay a growing paranoia of his own. He saw enemies in mirrors, heard plots and laughter. He too had started sleeping with a gun beside the bed. The war's survivors, drivers, messengers, gamblers, bootleggers, had grown quiet. They spoke only when necessary, their eyes dull with fatigue. People began calling them the silent ones, men who had seen too much to ever speak again. They moved through the markets like ghosts, exchanging envelopes, nodding, never smiling. Even the priests learned not to ask questions during confession. One icy afternoon, Lucky walked the length of Mulberry Street alone. The city smelled of coal smoke and roasted chestnuts, a sweetness that did little to hide decay. He stopped before a shop window where mannequins stood in dusty suits, frozen in mock confidence. Their reflection merged with his own, a man half real, half shadow. He wondered how many versions of himself existed now. The loyal soldier, the traitor, the peacemaker, the dreamer. At a newsstand, a headline caught his eye: "Gang war still unsolved, police helpless." He smiled faintly. The city was learning to live with the problem the way one lives with rain. That evening he met Bugsy Siegel in a dim speakeasy uptown. Jazz murmured through the haze. The crowd laughed too loudly, desperate to drown out winter. Bugsy leaned across the table, eyes alive. "Word is Masseria's broke. The bootlegging routes are gone, the cops are paid off by the other side. He's finished, Charlie. We just have to push." Lucky stirred his drink slowly. "Not yet." Bugsy frowned. "Then when?" "When he asks me to save him." The younger man laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You scare me sometimes." Lucky smiled. "That's good. Fear keeps us careful." Outside the snow thickened. Cars slid along the curbs, headlights diffused in the mist. New York felt suspended, a world holding its breath. Weeks passed. The killings nearly stopped. Both camps claimed victory, neither believed it. The silence became unbearable. Men who had survived bullets now jumped at footsteps. The city itself seemed to shrink, its energy drained into dread. Then one night Lucky received a message. A dinner invitation from Masseria himself. The note was brief, written by one of the boss's men. "Tomorrow. Much. Coney Island." No explanation. No choice. He read it twice, then folded it neatly into his coat pocket. He didn't tell Meyer. He didn't tell Bugsy. Some roads he knew could only be walked alone. That night he sat in his apartment, lights low, listening to the city hum below. A radio played faint Italian songs that blurred into static. He thought of the years behind him, of backroom deals, betrayals, and faces that had disappeared one by one. He thought of his mother, praying for him somewhere in the Bronx. He thought of how tired he was of pretending to be the man everyone else expected. Sleep came late, thin and gray like dawn itself. The next day was cold but clear. He dressed with care, charcoal suit, silk tie, polished shoes. As he adjusted his cufflinks, he caught his reflection in the mirror and saw not a soldier, not a gangster but a negotiator. A man preparing to end a war without firing a shot. The drive to Coney Island was long and quiet. The city passed in shades of gray, buildings half hidden in fog. He could smell the sea before he saw it. The restaurant stood near the boardwalk, shutters rattling in the wind. Inside, the tables were mostly empty. Masseria waited at a corner booth, coat draped over the seat, deck of cards laid out before him. He looked smaller somehow, his once thick hair now thin, his confidence frayed. "Charlie," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Sit. We talk like family." Luciano sat, removing his gloves. The waiter poured wine, then retreated. "I know you've been talking to Maranzano," Masseria began, voice soft but sharp. "Everyone talks. I don't blame you. The man's got charm. But charm doesn't last." Lucky met his gaze calmly. "Neither does fear." Masseria chuckled without humor. "You sound like an American again. You think business replaces blood." "I think business keeps blood inside the body," Lucky said. For a moment the old man stared at him, and something in his eyes, fatigue, maybe understanding, flickered. Then he nodded slowly, almost with relief. "Maybe you're right." He reached for his wine glass. Outside, a car door shut. Inside, the silence stretched thin as glass. What happened next would become legend. A handful of shots, quick, efficient, no witnesses who spoke. By the time the waiter returned, the wine had spilled across the tablecloth like a spreading wound. Lucky was gone. News spread through the underworld before dusk. Joe the boss Masseria, dead. Some called it betrayal, others called it mercy. The war, everyone whispered, was over. In a quiet apartment that night, Lucky sat with Meyer Lansky. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally Meyer asked, "It's done?" Lucky nodded once. "And now?" "Now," he said softly, "we make peace worth something." Outside, snow fell again, heavier this time, erasing footprints before they could freeze. Across the river, Maranzano poured himself a glass of grappa and looked out at the skyline, smiling like a man who believed he had inherited an empire. But even as he smiled, the first seeds of doubt stirred within him. The Americans, he thought, were clever. Too clever to serve forever. In that winter silence, between one death and the next, New York finally exhaled. The guns quieted. The markets reopened. The old men retreated into memory. And the silent ones, the survivors, walked through the snow with their heads down, carrying secrets heavy enough to last a lifetime. Lucky watched from his window as morning broke over the East River. The light touched the rooftops like forgiveness. He lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and thought of the future waiting just beyond the horizon, a future built not on noise but on silence. The wind coming off the Atlantic that April morning was thin and cold, cutting through Coney Island's empty boardwalk like a whisper that no one answered. The carousel stood still, its painted horses dull under the gray sky. A few gulls wheeled above the rooftops, crying out as though to mark an ending they didn't understand. The amusement arcades were shuttered, the laughter gone, the smell of salt and old popcorn drifting through the silence. Inside a small restaurant near the shore, the tables were already set though no customers had arrived. The owner had been told to close for a private lunch. He didn't ask who for. Men who asked questions rarely lasted long in this part of Brooklyn. He simply nodded, locked the front door and retreated to the kitchen. The room smelled faintly of wine, bread, and anxiety. Joe Masseria arrived first. The driver opened the door for him, and the old boss stepped inside slowly, like a man entering a memory. His overcoat hung heavy on his shoulders. His hat stayed low over his eyes. He carried himself as he always had, like someone who believed the room belonged to him even when it no longer did. He took his usual seat in the back corner, where the light from the window fell soft across the tablecloth. Before him lay a deck of cards, a half-full bottle of Chianti, and a plate of fresh linguine that steamed in the still air. He began shuffling the cards with the methodical grace of habit. The sound, soft, rhythmic, was almost soothing. Each shuffle seemed to mark another breath in the long decline of his empire. Outside, a car engine idled, then faded away. The sea murmured beyond the glass. When Charles Lucky Luciano entered, the bell above the door gave a single clear note. He removed his hat, nodded to the waiter, and crossed the floor with calm precision. His suit was charcoal gray, his tie silk. He looked every inch the businessman he had become, not the street soldier he once was. He smiled as he approached the table, but his eyes were unreadable. "Boss," he said softly. "Charlie," Masseria answered, gesturing to the chair opposite. "Sit. We talk like family." Luciano sat. The waiter poured wine, the cork squealing faintly, and then disappeared into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. The restaurant fell quiet except for the ticking of a wall clock. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the old world and the new, two eras sharing one table. "You've done well," Masseria said finally. "Smart boy. Everyone says so. I always knew you would." His voice was rough with fatigue. "But you listen too much to outsiders. The Jew, the Irish. They don't understand respect." Luciano nodded once. "Maybe not respect. But they understand money." Masseria chuckled, though there was no joy in it. "You think dollars make men loyal?" "Fear, Charlie. Fear is what keeps order." "Fear keeps men silent," Lucky said. "Not loyal." The older man's smile faded. He set down the cards. "You talk like an American. You forget Sicily." Luciano shook his head. "I remember it too well. That's why I don't want to live there again." The words hung between them like smoke. Outside, the sea wind pressed against the windows, a low moan rising and falling. Masseria stared at the younger man for a long time, and something in his eyes, fatigue, perhaps acceptance, shifted. He sighed, reached for his wineglass and murmured almost kindly, "Maybe you're right." From somewhere down the block came the faint crunch of tires on gravel. Luciano's gaze flicked toward the window, then back. He smiled faintly as though at a private thought. "You should eat, boss. It's getting cold." Masseria twirled a forkful of pasta, the steam fogging his glasses. "You never eat when we meet. Always watching, always thinking." "Old habits," Lucky said. The clock ticked once more. A door creaked in the hallway beyond the kitchen. The sound was small, almost nothing, but Masseria's head turned slightly toward it. He frowned. Then came the noise, soft, contained, final. The restaurant filled with the brief metallic cough of suppressed gunfire, no louder than the breaking of glass. Masseria's hand froze midway to his plate. A red bloom spread across the white linen, seeping outward like spilled wine. His eyes widened, more from surprise than pain. The cards scattered from his hand and fell to the floor in slow motion. A queen, a 10, a 5 drifting down through the still air. Luciano rose calmly, adjusted his cuffs and stepped back. His expression did not change. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic tick of the clock that refused to stop. In the kitchen the door swung once, then closed again. Lucky stood for a moment longer, looking down at the man who had once ruled New York. He felt no triumph, only relief, the relief of inevitability finally fulfilled. The old world had ended exactly as it must, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. He placed a few bills beside the wine bottle as though settling a debt, then turned and walked toward the door. The cold air met him like absolution. He slipped on his hat, stepped into the sunlight, and walked down the boardwalk while the gulls circled overhead. Behind him, the restaurant remained still. The waiter would find the body minutes later. The papers would find the story hours after that. By nightfall, every speakeasy in the city would be buzzing with the same phrase whispered again and again: "Joe the boss is dead." That evening, Luciano met Meyer Lansky in a small apartment near the river. The curtains were drawn. A single lamp cast a soft yellow pool across the table. For a long while neither man spoke. The city outside was distant, muffled by snow and distance. Finally Meyer asked, "It's done?" Luciano nodded. "Yes." "Was it hard?" "No," he said quietly. "It was necessary." They sat in silence, the kind that comes only after something irrevocable. The sound of a tugboat horn drifted through the window, long and low, like the city itself exhaling. "You know what happens next," Meyer said. "Yes," Lucky replied. "Maranzano thinks he's won." He leaned back, lighting a cigarette. The flame trembled slightly in the draft from the window. Let him think it. In the weeks that followed, the city moved as though waking from a nightmare. The shooting stopped. The markets reopened. Reporters wrote about peace in the underworld. Even the police celebrated, relieved to believe the storm had passed. But those who understood power knew that storms never end, they only change direction. Maranzano now stood at the center of the new order. He declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He reorganized the city into 5 families, each with its own captain, its own rules. On paper it was structure. In truth, it was another crown, another empire waiting to crumble. Luciano attended the first meeting in a borrowed office on Park Avenue. The windows overlooked the city lights and the furniture was heavy and new. Maranzano spoke for nearly an hour about loyalty, discipline, and Roman virtue. He compared himself to Julius Caesar, spoke of order born from chaos. The younger men listened politely, eyes hooded, exchanging glances when he looked away. When the speech ended, Luciano shook the new boss's hand, smiled, and said all the right things. Then he left the building and breathed in the cold air with a quiet certainty that nothing had changed, only the names. The empire still bled from the same wound, pride. That night, walking alone along the East River, he stopped to watch the reflection of the bridges shimmer on the dark water. The city was calm, but it was the fragile calm that comes before a new storm. He thought of Masseria, how the old man had died with cards in his hand, still believing in luck. He thought of Maranzano, already planning statues to himself. And he thought of the future he intended to build, one where no man wore a crown, where power sat at a table instead of a throne. He flicked his cigarette into the river and watched the ember fade. Behind him, the city lights blinked like stars too stubborn to rest. Somewhere, in a quiet apartment, Meyer Lansky poured 2 glasses of whiskey and waited. The revolution they had dreamed of was no longer a fantasy. It was unfolding, softly, invisibly, beneath the surface of peace. The old kings were gone. The architects were at work. For the first time in months, Luciano felt something close to sleep. Not relief exactly, but calm, the calm of a man who knows that the hardest part is done, and the next move is his. He walked home through streets dusted with snow, the air smelling faintly of bread and coal smoke. The city was still awake as it always was, but its heartbeat had slowed. In that rhythm, in that silence, he heard the promise of what was coming. The lunch at Coney Island was already fading into legend. Tomorrow it would be retold, reshaped, reduced to rumor. But for those who understood, it marked the true beginning, the moment when the old world surrendered to the new. And so the night settled over New York again, soft and endless. The sea kept whispering against the shore. The gulls circled above an empty boardwalk. And in the quiet heart of the city, a man named Lucky Luciano closed his eyes and finally, briefly, slept. The city exhaled after the killing. For the first time in years, the sound of gunfire no longer echoed through the alleys of Little Italy. The markets reopened, the cafes filled again, and the people who had learned to walk fast began to linger once more. But under the calm, everyone sensed it, a new order settling over the city, invisible but heavy as dust. At the center of it sat Salvatore Maranzano. He had survived the war and in surviving had become something greater, or so he believed. The newspapers called him the new king of the underworld, the capo di tutti capi. His men called him Don Salvatore, a title he accepted with the solemn air of a priest accepting confession. In truth, the crown weighed more than he expected. Power rarely felt like victory, it felt like obligation. His headquarters occupied the top floor of an office building on Park Avenue. Marble floors, heavy curtains, the faint smell of cigars and polished wood. From his window Maranzano could look down on the city he had claimed. The traffic moved like veins through stone, the bridges stretched like arms across the water. He saw order where others saw chaos. That pleased him. Every morning he arrived before his secretaries, carrying a leather briefcase filled with reports, names, maps. He would sit at his desk, open a worn volume of Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, and read for an hour before anyone entered. He admired Caesar not for his conquest but for his method, the precision with which he turned ambition into system. When his lieutenants arrived, he greeted them with the same formality every day. "You are soldiers," he would say. "But soldiers must learn to be citizens." They nodded, though few understood what he meant. Most were simple men who had grown rich from bootlegging and extortion, not philosophers of empire. Still they listened. He had won the war and that was enough for now. On paper the structure he built was flawless. The city was divided into 5 families, each with a boss, an underboss, a consigliere, and a hierarchy beneath. No one man could control everything but all reported upward to him. It was, in his eyes, Rome reborn, loyalty enforced not just by fear but by ritual. And yet, beneath the marble order, cracks already formed. The younger generation, men like Luciano Lansky Siegel, saw the new system for what it was. A replica of the old world wrapped in Latin names and nostalgia. They smiled, nodded, played their parts. But they had no intention of serving another king. For now they watched. Waiting required patience, and patience was what Luciano had learned best. He attended every meeting Maranzano called, dressed immaculately, respectful, deferential. He took notes, agreed to every order, bowed when expected. He became indispensable, the image of loyalty itself. Only Meyer Lansky could see the faint amusement in his eyes when Maranzano lectured about virtue and discipline. At night, after these long meetings, Luciano would walk the dark streets back toward his apartment, his breath ghosting in the cold. He would stop sometimes before a closed shop window and see his reflection, a man surrounded by the ghosts of his own restraint. Beneath that calm exterior, an idea was already forming. An order without thrones, without kings, where the underworld could run like a business, not a monarchy. He knew it would come, he just didn't yet know how. Meanwhile, Maranzano's paranoia began to grow. He had seen what ambition looked like, he recognized it in the faces of those who bowed to him too smoothly. He started keeping his meetings smaller, his circle tighter. He hired bodyguards fresh from Sicily, men who spoke little English and trusted no one. He changed his schedule daily, ate only food prepared by his own cook, and slept behind a locked steel door. To the outside world he was the embodiment of control. To those who served him, he had begun to look like a man haunted by his own success. One evening, as he sat in his office surrounded by maps, he called his most trusted aide. "This Luciano," he said, "he smiles too easily. He is clever, too clever. I think he plans something." The aide hesitated. "He is young, Don Salvatore. Maybe he only wants to please you." Maranzano's gaze was cold. Caesar thought the same of Brutus. The aide nodded and said nothing more. Across town, Lucky Luciano met with Meyer Lansky in a quiet restaurant after hours. The owner had long since gone home, only the sound of rain filled the space. A single candle flickered between them. "He's losing his mind," Meyer said. "Half his men hate him. The other half are waiting to see who kills him first." Lucky stirred the wine in his glass, watching the ripples. "He's building a church in a city that only knows business. The old ways won't hold. Not here." Meyer leaned in. "Then what do you do?" Luciano looked up, his expression calm. "What I always do. I wait until he believes I'm his most loyal son." Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the river. Weeks passed. Maranzano's office became more fortress than workplace. Visitors were searched, even those he had known for years. He ordered reports on everyone, their families, their debts, their ambitions. He spoke less of Caesar now and more of betrayal. He began to talk of purges, of cleansing his organization of the unfaithful. Luciano heard this through whispers carried by frightened men. He listened, nodded, said nothing. When the time came he would act, not from hatred but necessity. Still, a small part of him felt a kind of sorrow for the old Sicilian. Maranzano was not evil, he was simply out of time. A man of the ancient world standing in the bright noise of a new one. He believed in hierarchy, in obedience, in the poetry of power. Luciano believed in efficiency. The difference was enough to decide the future. On a late August morning, Maranzano stood before his office window, the city glittering below like a promise he no longer trusted. He thought of the hills of Castellammarese, of the olive groves and the sea. He wondered briefly if it had all been worth it. The men he had led were rich now but restless. The peace he had promised felt hollow. He reached for his Bible, thumbed through the worn pages and murmured a prayer. In another part of the city, Luciano was on the phone. His voice was low, measured. "It has to look clean," he said. "No noise. No chaos. He wants Rome, give him an assassination fit for an emperor." The plan moved like a tide, quiet, inevitable. By early September, Maranzano's nerves were threadbare. He called for another meeting, this time limited to a handful of trusted captains. Among the names he mentioned privately was Luciano's. He intended, he said, to remove the younger man before he could rise too far. The words reached Lucky within a day. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, smoking, the city spread beneath him in electric veins. The choice was no longer moral or emotional. It was arithmetic. One life to secure a future free of endless wars. When morning came, the air was clear and sharp. In his Park Avenue office, Maranzano waited, unaware that the visitors who climbed the stairs were not his new bodyguards as he had been told, but killers sent by the man he feared most. They entered quietly. No gunfire. Only the short, soft struggle of inevitability. When it was done, they left as they had arrived, calm, efficient, unseen. By evening, the news had spread through every corner of the city. Maranzano dead. The newspapers called it the end of an era. They were right, though they didn't yet know what kind. That night, Luciano stood by his window again, the skyline burning with 1,000 small lights. The city below was quiet, almost gentle. He poured himself a drink and raised it slightly toward the glass, as though toasting the ghost of the man he had replaced. Caesar had to fall, he murmured. But Rome remains. Across town, Meyer Lansky wrote a few words in his notebook, a habit he kept for years. September 1931, the old world finally buried. The new one begins tomorrow. And so it did. From that day on, there would be no kings in the American underworld, no bosses above bosses. There would be a council, men sitting as equals, settling disputes with logic instead of bullets. It would be called the Commission. And in its quiet birth, the Mafia became not just a family but an institution, a structure that would outlast all its architects. In the calm that followed, the city slept again. The wind moved softly between the buildings, carrying away the last echoes of a war that had lasted too long. Somewhere a phonograph played faint jazz, somewhere else a priest locked the church after evening mass. Life continued, patient, indifferent. And in the silence that filled New York that night, Lucky Luciano finally became what he had always intended to be. Not a ruler but an organizer, a man who had turned violence into order, chaos into symmetry, and history into a whisper. The war was over. The empire was reborn. And the city, unaware of the quiet revolution beneath its streets, kept dreaming. The day after Maranzano's death, New York looked almost innocent again. The morning sun poured over the rooftops as if to wash them clean, and the newspapers fluttered along the sidewalks like pale birds. The headlines spoke of gang intrigue, of business rivalries, but to the men who understood, it was the end of a dynasty. There was no mourning, only relief. The city had grown tired of emperors. In a small apartment above the East River, Lucky Luciano stood by the window, cigarette smoke curling in slow ribbons toward the ceiling. He had not slept, yet he felt rested. Outside, tugboats groaned on the water. The hum of the waking city rose like a prayer. Somewhere below, a boy whistled a tune from a Broadway show. The world had already moved on. Meyer Lansky arrived quietly, coat collar turned up against the wind. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Lucky. "It's done," he said. "No one's talking. No one wants to." Lucky nodded. "Good. Let them believe it was fate." For a while they stood in silence, watching the river move beneath the bridges. Finally Meyer said, "So what now?" "Now," Lucky answered, "we build what they never could." He spoke without heat, as though discussing architecture rather than empire. He had learned that revolutions did not begin with gunfire, they began with structure. That week he sent quiet messages across the country, to Al Capone's outfit in Chicago, to Stefano Megadino in Buffalo, to bosses in Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia. The wording was simple, an invitation, not a command. A meeting to discuss peace. They met in late November in a hotel near Chicago's outskirts. Snow covered the fields beyond the windows, the city's lights shimmered faintly in the distance. Inside the ballroom, the air smelled of cigars and leather. Around the long table sat the most powerful men in organized crime, Italians, Jews, even a few Irishmen who had traded pistols for ledgers. Luciano took the head of the table not by demand but by consensus. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady. "We've killed enough," he said. "And for what? A title? A throne that only brings more war? From now on there's no boss of bosses. No Caesar. We sit together. We decide together." The room stayed silent, but heads began to nod. Even men who had built their lives on violence understood the logic of survival. Profit loved stability. Chaos bled it dry. He continued, "Each city keeps its own business. Disputes go through a council. 5 families here in New York, the rest across the country. No one man above the others." Capone's representative leaned back, smiling. "You're talking like a banker, kid?" Luciano smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what we need now. Less kings. More accountants." Laughter rippled through the room, not loud but genuine. The tension broke. A new order, born not in fear but in understanding, settled quietly into place. They called it the Commission. It had no flag, no anthem, no headquarters, only meetings held in shadow, decisions carried by whispers. Yet within months, it reached farther than any government office or police precinct. It balanced crime the way an orchestra balances sound, each note distinct but part of the same slow harmony. When the gathering ended, Luciano walked out into the cold. The night air smelled of coal smoke and snow. He felt something rare for him: peace. Not joy, just peace. He thought of all the men who had died believing power was something you held in your fists, not something you distributed through trust. He hoped they were finally at rest. Back in New York, the families adjusted to the new rhythm. Money flowed more predictably. Turf wars dwindled. Even the newspapers noticed. Crime rate down, New York unusually calm, one headline said, as if peace itself were suspicious. Luciano visited the old neighborhoods less now. When he did, the elders greeted him with cautious respect. They saw in him both betrayal and salvation, the son who had turned against tradition but saved them from extinction. Sometimes he would stop outside a bakery and watch the children play in the street, their laughter echoing between the tenements. None of them knew his name, and that suited him fine. He had learned that the greatest power was the kind that left no trace. Still, there were nights when memory pressed close. He would dream of Masseria's heavy hands, of Maranzano's lectures about Caesar. He would wake before dawn, sweat cold on his neck, the city outside still dark. He would light a cigarette and whisper to no one, "No more kings." Meyer Lansky sometimes stayed with him those nights, both men sitting by the window watching the river lights flicker. "We did it," Meyer said once. "You know that, right?" Lucky exhaled smoke, eyes distant. For now. They both understood, peace was not permanent. It was maintenance, an agreement renewed every day by men with steady hands and calm voices. Still, for a time it worked. The underworld became organized in the truest sense. Rules replaced revenge. Meetings replaced murders. The newspapers lost interest. That was how they knew they were winning. Winter deepened. Snow layered the streets, muffling the horns and the footsteps. New York moved slower, kinder. To ordinary citizens, it was simply another season. To the men who had survived the war, it was something sacred, a season without funerals. One evening, Lucky returned to Coney Island. The restaurant where Masseria had died was gone now, replaced by a candy shop with bright lights and tin music playing from a radio. He stepped inside, bought a pack of cigarettes he didn't need, and stood by the window watching the boardwalk. The same gulls wheeled above the same gray sea. The wind carried the same salt. Yet everything had changed. He thought about how quiet it was. How peace, once achieved, sounded almost lonely. Then he smiled, faint and private, and walked back into the night. Behind him, the waves kept their rhythm against the shore, endless and indifferent. The city breathed steadily, its heart no longer divided. The age of kings was gone. In its place stood something colder, cleaner, more deliberate. A machine that would run for decades, invisible and constant like the tide itself. And somewhere in the hum of that great machine, Lucky Luciano disappeared into history, not with a shout, but with a whisper that still drifts through the quiet streets of New York whenever winter comes and the gulls cry over the sea. The winter wind that swept through Chicago in late November of 1931 carried the smell of coal and steel, of smoke rising from train yards and the river that refused to freeze. It was the kind of cold that made men hunch their shoulders and keep their secrets. Inside the Congress Hotel, a storm of a different kind was gathering, silent, invisible, hidden behind curtains and cigar smoke. The city outside knew nothing. The newspapers spoke of politics, of labor strikes, of Al Capone's imprisonment. No one mentioned that, behind locked doors, the most powerful criminals in America were sitting together for the first time in history. The marble lobby glowed under chandeliers. Bellboys moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. On the upper floor, a suite had been emptied of its usual guests, its windows drawn shut against the cold. Inside, a long table had been set with coffee, ashtrays and maps. Around it sat men whose names would never appear together again. Lucky Luciano, calm as ever, sat near the center. To his left, Meyer Lansky, quiet and watchful. To his right, Frank Costello, cigarette burning low between his fingers. Across from them, Stefano Megadino from Buffalo, his heavy hands folded over his stomach. The Chicago outfit sent Frank Nitti, Capone's trusted enforcer, now acting boss while the big guy served time in prison. Representatives from Cleveland, Detroit and Philadelphia filled the remaining seats. The air was heavy with the scent of tobacco and diplomacy. No one spoke for several minutes. It was not silence born of fear but of gravity. Everyone understood the weight of what this meeting could mean. Finally Luciano broke it. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we all know why we're here." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they drew every eye in the room. "For years we fought," he continued. Over names, over pride, over streets that aren't even ours. The old bosses are gone. The old ways died with them. It's time we stop killing and start managing. He let the sentence hang. In the quiet, a radiator hissed softly. This thing of ours, he said, has grown too big for kings. From now on there are no more crowns. Only a table, this table, where we sit as equals. Disputes come here, not to the streets. Votes decide, not bullets. Frank Nitti leaned back, exhaling smoke through his nose. Sounds like you're building a corporation, Charlie? Luciano's lips curved into a faint smile. That's exactly what it is. One that never goes bankrupt. A low murmur rippled around the room. No one laughed, but some men nodded, almost despite themselves. The idea was radical in its simplicity. The Mafia, reborn not as a feudal system but as a syndicate, a council of businessmen who happened to deal in illegal goods. Meyer Lansky unfolded a sheet of paper and placed it on the table. It was a chart, a clean, simple diagram showing how cities could share profits, settle disputes, and expand without chaos. He spoke little, but every word carried weight. We use arbitration instead of ambush. We share information instead of spies. The money gets bigger if we stop cutting each other's throats. Megadino grunted. And if someone refuses to play along? Luciano's gaze didn't waver. Then we remind him that peace is more profitable than war. No one questioned what that meant. The hours passed. Coffee was poured, maps were marked, territories discussed. Chicago would oversee the Midwest, New York the East Coast, Buffalo the border routes. Decisions that would shape half a century of American crime were made in voices so calm they might have belonged to bankers. When at last the meeting adjourned, the men rose slowly, each knowing they had witnessed something irreversible. Luciano remained seated, watching the snow begin to fall outside the window. The flakes caught the orange glow of the streetlights, falling like embers from a dying fire. Meyer Lansky placed a hand on his shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. Lucky shook his head. We did it. But remember, peace doesn't last on its own. It needs tending. Lansky nodded. So does money. They both smiled. It was not triumph, not celebration, only the calm satisfaction of architects seeing their foundation hold. Down in the lobby, the sound of typewriters echoed from the front desk. Guests checked in, unaware that history had just shifted above their heads. The bellhop who held the door for Luciano would later swear he'd never seen anything strange that day, just a few quiet businessmen in fine suits, leaving without a word. Outside the cold air stung. The street smelled of gasoline and snow. Luciano lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the wind. He thought of Masseria and Maranzano, of all the men who had died believing power meant standing above others. They had built their empires like towers, tall and brittle. He preferred bridges, strong, low, and wide. As he walked toward the waiting car, Meyer fell into step beside him. What do you think they'll call it? Lansky asked. Luciano smiled faintly. They'll call it the Commission. But it's really just common sense. The car doors closed. The driver pulled away from the curb. Behind them, the hotel loomed against the gray sky, its lights glowing like quiet constellations in the snow. The drive through the city was long and wordless. Factories smoked on the horizon. The streets gleamed wet and empty. At a stoplight, Luciano rolled down his window, letting the cold air fill the car. He breathed deeply. The smell of iron and river water reminded him of New York, of beginnings and endings, of all he had lost and what he had gained. Back in the hotel, the cleaning staff moved through the meeting room. They cleared the ashtrays, folded the maps, wiped away the faint ring of coffee from the polished wood. By morning there would be no trace of what had happened there. That was how Luciano wanted it. The future, he believed, should leave no fingerprints. When he returned to New York, the city greeted him like a creature that had learned to purr after years of growling. The markets thrived, the bootleggers prospered, and for the first time in memory, the underworld felt almost civilized. Reporters noticed the absence of headlines. Police precincts reported fewer shootings, fewer corpses pulled from the docks. Some called it luck. Others called it organization. Both were true. Luciano spent his days in offices now, not bars or backrooms. He met with lawyers, accountants, even politicians who owed him favors. He wore lighter suits, smiled more easily, spoke less. The transformation was complete. The boy from the streets had become the quiet ruler of a system that no longer needed crowns. One evening, he stood at the edge of the East River, the wind carrying the chill of distant snow. The city stretched before him, vast and glittering. Behind him, Meyer said, "You think it'll last?" Lucky didn't turn. It'll last as long as men remember what it cost. They both looked out at the dark water, silent. Somewhere in the distance, a ship horn sounded, long, low, mournful. It echoed across the river, fading into the hum of the sleepless city. In the years to come, historians would mark that winter as a turning point, though few would ever understand what had really happened in that Chicago hotel. The Mafia had become an institution, its violence hidden beneath manners, its power wrapped in procedure. The men who built it would die or vanish, but their order would endure, invisible, steady, inevitable. And through it all, the city would keep breathing, half aware, half dreaming, as the snow kept falling into the river, melting on contact, disappearing into the current that carried everything quietly, endlessly toward the sea. Winter in New York arrived quietly that year, like an apology after years of noise. The city's breath steamed against the cold, and the harbor lights flickered through mist that smelled faintly of salt and coal. For the first time in memory, there were no funerals in Little Italy. The war was over, the kings were gone, and what remained was a silence so deep that people mistook it for peace. In that stillness, Charles Lucky Luciano began the final act of his design. The Chicago summit had planted the seed, now it had to take root. Across 5 boroughs, men waited for direction. Captains, bookmakers, smugglers, fixers, each unsure what came next. The city needed structure, something permanent, something that could outlive its architects. He called the first meeting in a borrowed office overlooking Madison Avenue. The room was modest, its windows fogged, the smell of cigarettes clinging to the wallpaper. Around the table sat the new rulers of New York: Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, and Joe Prophesy. 5 families, 1 table. Luciano entered last, without ceremony. He wore no hat, carried no bodyguards, and spoke with the calm of a man discussing business, not destiny. "This isn't about power," he said. "It's about balance." The others listened in silence. Outside, horns echoed faintly through the snow. No more boss of bosses. No more wars. Every family handles its own territory. Disputes come here, to the table. We vote, we settle, we move on. That's how we keep the peace. Bonanno, youngest among them, leaned forward. "And if someone breaks the peace?" Luciano's eyes stayed steady. "Then we remind him why peace is cheaper." No threats, no raised voice. The simplicity of the answer was enough. He reached into his coat and placed a single sheet of paper on the table, a list of 10 rules written in neat, careful script. He called them principles. No one was to speak to police. No one was to harm the innocent. No business was to be done with narcotics without the council's consent. All profits from unions and gambling would be reported, percentages shared fairly. It read less like a code of honor and more like the bylaws of a corporation. "Follow this," he said, "and no one has to die again." Genovese frowned. "And you, Lucky? Who enforces it?" Luciano smiled faintly. "All of us. Or none of us. That's the point." For a moment the room was still. Then Costello poured wine into the waiting glasses. They drank, not to victory but to endurance. By evening, a quiet understanding had settled among them. The commission was born, not with signatures or ceremonies, but with nods and handshakes. No headlines would mark the occasion. Only the city itself would feel the change, subtle and profound, the heartbeat of chaos slowing to a steady rhythm. In the weeks that followed, the system took shape like architecture rising from fog. Meetings were scheduled monthly. Ledgers replaced whispers. Money flowed through unseen channels: unions, construction, the docks. The families learned to coexist, their rivalries absorbed by the council's patience. Luciano spent his days moving from office to office, always in motion but never hurried. He spoke softly, smiled easily, and rarely needed to raise his hand. Respect came not from fear but from efficiency. The men who once measured strength by body counts now measured it by profit margins. At night, when the city dimmed and the noise sank into the river's slow pulse, he would sit with Meyer Lansky in the back booth of an all-night diner near the Bowery. The counterman knew them as 2 businessmen who liked their coffee black and their conversations quiet. "You realize what you've built," Meyer said one night. "It's bigger than any of us. It's government without a flag." Luciano stirred his cup. "That's the idea. Governments fall. Ideas last." Meyer smiled faintly. "You ever think about what happens when you're gone?" Lucky exhaled, watching the steam drift upward. "By then it won't matter who runs it. The rules will run it." Outside, snow gathered on the fire escapes, muting the city into a soft hush. Taxi lights blurred through the flakes. For the first time in years, New York looked peaceful. It was a fragile kind of peace but real. Across the country the same structure spread: Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, Los Angeles. Even Chicago, under Nitti, adopted the council's methods. Every family, every territory tied by quiet consensus. Disputes were handled like business negotiations. Murders became rare, surgical, sanctioned only when absolutely necessary. The age of roaring gang wars was gone. In its place stood bureaucracy, a shadow government run with the precision of an accounting firm. One cold afternoon, Luciano visited the Lower East Side, the streets where he had hustled as a boy. The pushcarts were still there, though newer, now brighter. Children shouted in English instead of Italian. He stopped beside a bakery and bought a loaf of bread from a woman who didn't recognize him. She thanked him in accented English, and he smiled, realizing how far he had traveled from the world that made him. That evening, as twilight poured between the buildings, he walked along the East River. The water moved dark and patient beneath the bridges. He thought of the men who had come before, Masseria, Maranzano, even Capone, and how each had believed himself invincible until the wind changed. He had no illusions. He knew one day the same tide would turn on him. But until then he would keep the machine running, quiet and clean. In the months that followed, the commission proved itself. Disputes were settled before they became wars. Profits soared. Politicians, once courted with envelopes of cash, now came seeking advice. The line between law and crime blurred until even those who drew it couldn't tell which side they stood on. Luciano preferred it that way. Control worked best when no one noticed it existed. By spring, New York had become something rare, a city at ease. The docks hummed, the speakeasies thrived, the police looked the other way. Even the newspapers, desperate for scandal, found nothing to print. Peace, it turned out, was bad for headlines. One evening, standing at his apartment window, Lucky looked out across the glittering skyline and felt the faint hum of the city settle into his chest. He realized it wasn't pride he felt, but calm. A deep, quiet calm, like standing at the center of a storm that no longer knew his name. Meyer's voice came from behind him. "You did what every emperor tries to do, you made yourself unnecessary." Luciano smiled. Good. Maybe that's what power's supposed to be. Below them, the city lights blinked like 1,000 small promises. The river whispered against the docks. Somewhere, a saxophone played through an open window, the notes rising and fading into the night. The commission had no anthem, no monument, no public face. Yet its shadow stretched from one coast to the other, invisible but absolute. It was the quiet heartbeat of organized order, pulsing beneath the noise of ordinary life. And in that hush, Lucky Luciano, once a boy from Mulberry Street, once a lieutenant, once a rebel, became something new. Not a king, not even a ruler, but the architect of balance. The world above slept peacefully, never knowing whose dream it rested inside. Spring arrived in New York with a kind of tired grace. The snow melted from the gutters, the river breathed again, and the city's pulse returned to something that almost felt human. People filled the cafes, newspapers spoke of optimism, and for the first time in years, the underworld moved quietly enough that no one noticed it was still there. At the heart of that quiet stood Charles, Lucky Luciano, the man who had turned war into order. He never raised his voice, never signed his name. His presence was felt more than seen, like the hum of electricity beneath a city that pretended to sleep. He lived now in an apartment overlooking Central Park, high enough that the noise of the street reached him only as a soft, distant murmur. The walls were lined with books and framed photographs. A young Luciano beside Meyer Lansky at Coney Island, another of the 5 families at the first council meeting. There was nothing extravagant, just elegance, restraint, and quiet. His days had become a routine of meetings that felt more like board sessions than criminal councils. His evenings were spent listening to jazz on the radio and writing notes in a small black notebook no one else ever saw. He was still in his 30s, but he carried himself like a man much older, one who had already lived through too many endings. The commission thrived under his invisible hand. Disputes were settled in days instead of months. The docks ran smoothly, unions delivered their dues without fuss. Gambling, loans, construction, and nightclubs, all flowed upward in silent tributaries that met at one calm center. Politicians found their campaigns mysteriously funded. Police precincts discovered unexpected donations to retirement funds. Everyone, it seemed, was a little more comfortable than before. To the public it looked like peace. To those inside it was management perfected. Luciano called it balance. Once a month, he invited the heads of the families to dinner, not in smoky backrooms, but in the private halls of respectable restaurants where the waiters wore gloves and the wine came from his own shipments. There were no guns on the table, only cigars, laughter, and ledgers. Deals were discussed in murmurs. Disagreements were dissolved with arithmetic. The men who had once shouted across battle lines now toasted one another like partners in a company that had outgrown violence. Even Meyer Lansky, who had seen every side of him, admitted one night, "You've done what kings couldn't do, you made peace profitable." Lucky smiled. "Profit's just the language they understand. Peace is the translation." Outside those dinners, he moved carefully through the city. The police knew who he was but couldn't touch him. The newspapers called him the model gangster, the one who wore tailored suits and said please. He granted no interviews, gave no speeches. He existed somewhere between myth and management, like a ghost who kept the lights on. Yet, in the stillness of his new life, restlessness crept in. He would sometimes walk alone through the streets after midnight, hat pulled low, coat collar raised against the wind. He passed the old tenements where he had grown up, the stoops where he had made his first deals. The children who played there now didn't know his name. That anonymity, once his shield, began to feel like exile. He wondered if this was what power always became, silence. One evening he visited Meyer in his apartment downtown. The place smelled of tobacco and ink. Lansky was bent over papers, calculating percentages by hand. "You ever think it'll all fall apart?" he asked without looking up. Lucky poured himself a drink. "Everything falls apart. The trick is building something that takes its time doing it." Meyer looked up, smiling faintly. "And what happens when they come for you?" "They already have," Luciano said. "They just don't know it yet." Outside, thunder rolled over the city, a slow growl swallowed by distance. The world was changing again. Prohibition was ending. The liquor trade that had built empires was drying up, replaced by legal bars that no longer needed bootleggers. The old money was gone. New money had to be invented. Luciano saw it before anyone else. He began shifting investments quietly, into construction, into entertainment, into legitimate fronts that would outlast any law. He started meeting with businessmen who had never set foot in Little Italy. They wore tuxedos instead of trench coats, spoke of stock prices and real estate. They thought of him as a quiet investor with impeccable instincts. He preferred it that way. The transformation was nearly complete. The Mafia had become invisible. The warlords were now shareholders. The guns, if they existed, were buried under ledgers. But not everyone accepted the calm. In dark corners of the city, old men grumbled that America had made their sons soft. They whispered about Sicilian honor, about forgotten codes. They missed the noise of the old days even if it had been filled with death. Luciano ignored them. He knew nostalgia was the most dangerous addiction of all. He continued to travel, to Chicago, to Cleveland, even to Havana, building quiet alliances that crossed oceans. He was polite, punctual, and patient. When he entered a room, conversation stopped not from fear but respect. He had become the embodiment of what his generation wanted. A modern boss, fluent in both corruption and civility. Still, there were nights when he felt the walls closing in. The FBI was growing bolder, federal prosecutors more ambitious. He saw their names in the papers and knew they saw his. The balance he had built depended on discretion, and discretion was a fragile thing. One photograph, one careless word could unravel everything. Late one night, alone in his apartment, he opened the window and let the cold air in. The city stretched before him. Endless lights, endless stories. Somewhere out there, a detective was probably writing his name on a list. Somewhere else, a newspaper editor was deciding whether to print it. He smiled, thinking of Masseria's superstition, of Maranzano's lectures about Caesar. Both men had died believing they could outlive history. He had no such delusion. He only wanted to outlast the morning. The knock came quietly the next day, 2 federal agents with polite smiles and warrants. They spoke in practiced tones about public morals and vice rackets. They mentioned testimony, whispered names. Luciano listened, expression calm, then nodded. He had expected this. Power, he knew, always invited attention. The trial that followed would make headlines, though not for violence. It was built on rumors, half-truths, and favors owed. But for the first time, the calm man at the center of the empire stood beneath a courthouse ceiling instead of a chandelier. Reporters wrote about his suits, his composure, his faint smile. When the verdict came, he nodded once, as though approving an inevitable decision. 10 years, they said. He thanked the judge, shook hands with his lawyer, and walked out as quietly as he had walked in. Behind bars he became a myth. Outside, the machine kept running. The commission held its meetings, profits flowed, and the city barely noticed his absence. That, more than anything, was proof of his success. He had built something that no longer needed him to survive. Years later, when visitors asked how he managed it, he would answer with the same calm smile, "I just made crime reasonable." But in the silence of his cell at night, he sometimes thought of the streets he had once ruled, the smell of chestnuts in winter, the sound of church bells through fog, the taste of freedom that came from walking without fear. He missed none of the power, only the air. The world beyond those walls kept changing. War was coming overseas. The same politicians who had condemned him began to wonder if his connections could help them. The government whispered of cooperation, of intelligence, of favors. He listened, said little, waited. Patience, after all, was his oldest skill. And when the time came, history turned once more toward him, not as a criminal but as an asset. It was ironic, almost poetic, that the man who had built an empire of silence would one day serve his country through secrets. He found it amusing, though he never laughed about it. He knew too well how quickly fortune changed its mind. From his cell window he could see a slice of the city, gray, endless, alive. The same city that had raised him, betrayed him, and become his greatest creation. He watched it as one watches an ocean tide, knowing that what he had built would move on without him, reshaping itself again and again. He smiled to himself, faintly, and whispered the words that had guided him since the beginning. No kings. Just balance. Outside, the world kept spinning. The commission still met. Money still changed hands. Men still bowed to rules they could no longer remember who had written. The age of Luciano continued, not through his presence, but through the quiet order he had left behind. And in the hum of the city's sleepless night, the rhythm of his design still pulsed, steady, unseen, eternal. The sea outside Naples moved in slow circles that spring morning, its color somewhere between silver and smoke. From the balcony of a small apartment overlooking the bay, Charles Lucky Luciano watched the fishing boats drift across the water. He was older now, his hair thinner, his suits lighter, his eyes calm in a way they had never been in New York. Exile, he had learned, was not a sentence, it was a kind of silence. A man could get used to silence if he'd built enough of it in his life. He had been gone from America for years. The deal that freed him had sent him here, back to the old country that no longer felt like home. The newspapers had called it justice, he called it balance. Behind the language of diplomacy, both sides got what they wanted. The government had its headlines. He had his freedom, limited but enough. From his balcony, he could see the outline of Mount Vesuvius, dark against the pale horizon. Some mornings it reminded him of Manhattan's skyline, jagged and patient. The volcano slept now, but he knew what slept could always wake. Each day followed the same rhythm. He rose late, drank espresso in the kitchen while the radio murmured songs from Rome. He read the foreign papers that arrived days late, his name sometimes appearing in small articles, rumors of business meetings, sightings in Havana or Sicily. He smiled at those. People always believed the quietest men were the busiest. At noon he walked to the harbor. The air there smelled of salt, tobacco and engine oil. Children chased pigeons along the quay, and old men played cards under umbrellas. Sometimes one of them recognized him, more often they didn't. He liked it better that way. Power, he thought, should always age into anonymity. Letters came from America, thin envelopes with New York postmarks. Meyer Lansky wrote occasionally, careful and brief. Everything steady. The machine hums. No kings. Just balance. The words made Luciano smile. Even oceans away, the rhythm of his creation endured. The commission still met. The rules still held. The city still slept under the same quiet order he had once dreamed of. He spent his afternoons at a cafe near the water, reading or simply watching the light change. The owner treated him like a regular, not a legend, which was a kindness he appreciated. Some days tourists passed through, Americans with cameras and bright laughter. They never looked twice at the older man in the corner with his coffee and his cigarette. That invisibility felt like a blessing. But at night, when the city went dim and the sea turned black, memories returned like tidewater. He saw the faces of the men who had built the empire beside him. Masseria, Maranzano, Costello, Meyer. He heard the muffled gunshots in restaurants, the laughter at long tables, the soft turning of cards in smoke-filled rooms. The sounds were ghosts now, gentle and distant, but they never left. Sometimes he dreamed of Little Italy in winter, the smell of roasted chestnuts, the flicker of lamps on wet cobblestones. In those dreams he was always walking somewhere, never arriving. The streets curved endlessly back on themselves, like memory refusing to end. One evening a storm moved in from the sea. The wind rattled the shutters and the power flickered in the cafes along the harbor. Luciano stood at his window, the same calm expression on his face. He thought of how everything he had built had depended on control of men, of chaos, of fear. Yet the world had gone on perfectly fine without him. That realization no longer hurt. It almost comforted him. He turned from the window, sat at the small desk by the bed and began to write. The words came slowly, carefully, in a hand that trembled only slightly. He didn't write about crime or history, he wrote about peace, the kind that comes only when a man stops needing to be remembered. He wrote of the sea, of balance, of how power was never truly owned, only borrowed. When he finished, he folded the pages neatly and placed them inside an envelope addressed to no one. The next morning the sky cleared. The sea was calm again, shining like polished glass. He dressed, combed his hair, and decided to walk to the cafe early. The waiter greeted him with a smile, poured his usual espresso, and left him in peace. Luciano sat quietly, the cup warm in his hands, watching the boats move out to the open water. A few minutes later, he leaned back in his chair, exhaled once, and closed his eyes. His heart stopped with the same composure that had guided the rest of his life, silently, without drama. When the waiter returned, he thought the man had fallen asleep. In a way he had. The news traveled fast, faster than he ever had. Luciano dead of heart failure in Naples cafe, the headlines read. Photographs showed his body being carried to a waiting car, his face peaceful, almost smiling. The papers called him the father of modern organized crime, the man who brought order to chaos. They wrote about glamour and sin, about the rise of the commission, about legends. None of it mattered anymore. The man himself was gone, and what he left behind was quieter than they would ever understand. In New York, Meyer Lansky received the cable while sitting in his study. He read it once, folded it, and placed it in a drawer. Then he poured 2 glasses of whiskey and set one on the table across from him. "You were right," he said softly into the empty room. "No kings. Just balance." Outside his window, the city still pulsed with its endless rhythm, horns, laughter, rain against glass. Somewhere in that hum, the invisible machine kept turning, efficient and patient, as though nothing had changed. Back in Naples, the cafe owner closed early that night. He left Luciano's table untouched, the cup half full, the chair slightly askew. The next morning he found a folded note beside the saucer. It held only a few words, written in a steady hand. "Everything ends. Only silence lasts." He kept the note, though he never told anyone why. The sea moved endlessly beyond the harbor, erasing footprints from the sand, carrying fragments of voices out to where they could dissolve. In the fading light, the waves glimmered like the city lights of a world half a lifetime away. And if you listen closely, on quiet nights when New York sleeps and the rivers breathe, you can almost hear it still, the low, steady hum of the balance he built. Not the roar of empires or the clash of ambition, but something gentler, almost human. The whisper of power made reasonable. The sound of order replacing chaos. The echo of one man's dream fading softly into peace.